At exactly 3:47 a.m., Colonel Koffi's phone buzzed with the message that would change everything. Operation Sunrise is go. Move now. Koffi stared at the screen in his darkened bedroom in Lomé. His hands shook slightly as he read the words again. After months of secret planning, the moment had finally arrived. For 18 years, Faure Gnassingbé had ruled Togo with an iron fist. Elections were rigged. Protesters disappeared. Journalists were silenced. The military had become the president's personal army rather than protectors of the people. But tonight that would end. Koffi thought about his daughter studying in Ghana because she couldn't speak freely in her own country. He thought about his brother who had fallen from a government building after asking questions about missing money. He thought about millions of Togolese who deserved better. He picked up his secure phone and dialed. "Captain Dasse," he said when she answered. "It's time." Captain Ama Dasse had been preparing for this night her entire military career. As the youngest female captain in the Togolese army, she had watched her country suffer under dictatorship while pretending to serve it faithfully. The presidential palace sat like a fortress in central Lomé. High walls, guard towers, elite soldiers who had sworn personal loyalty to Faure. But every fortress had weaknesses, and Dasse had spent months mapping them all. "Alpha Team, move to the East Gate," she whispered into her radio at 4:15 a.m. "Bravo Team, secure the communication center. Charlie Team, with me to the main entrance." The operation unfolded with military precision. Palace guards, caught completely off guard, barely had time to radio for help before discovering their communications had been cut. Some resisted, leading to brief firefights in the palace corridors. But by dawn it was over. Major Taimnou, head of palace security and Faure's most loyal enforcer, found himself surrounded in the control room. He had been desperately trying to contact military bases across the country, only to learn that the revolution was happening everywhere at once. "Sir," his aide reported with a trembling voice, "General Kajo Nsokode has joined the uprising. Colonel Atayag bin Kpalim is refusing all orders. And sir, the garrison in Bafilo has arrested the regional governor." Taimnou realized the truth. This wasn't just a palace coup. It was a nationwide revolution. President Faure Gnassingbé paced frantically in his private quarters on the third floor of the palace. The man who had ruled absolutely for nearly 2 decades was now trapped, his communications dead, his escape routes blocked. His wife China sat silently in the corner. Their children had been evacuated to France weeks earlier, a precaution that now seemed like prophecy. "The helicopter," Faure muttered, his usual calm completely shattered. "There's still the helicopter on the roof." But even as he spoke, the sound of rotor blades filled the air. Through the bulletproof windows, he could see military helicopters circling the palace, their searchlights cutting through the morning mist. The door exploded inward. Colonel Koffi stepped through the smoke, flanked by 6 soldiers. Behind them came Captain Dasse, carrying handcuffs that gleamed in the morning light. "Faure Gnassingbé," Koffi's voice was steady and official. "You are under arrest for crimes against the people of Togo." For a moment, the room was silent except for the distant sound of crowds beginning to celebrate in the streets below. Then Faure laughed, a bitter, desperate sound. "You think this changes anything? Look at Libya. Look at what happens when strongmen fall." Captain Dasse stepped forward. "The difference is that this time we have a plan." What happened next became one of the most watched videos in African history. Faure refused to walk. Whether from shock, defiance, or simple inability to process his fall from power, he collapsed to his knees in the ornate hallway outside his quarters. "I will not be humiliated," he whispered, then shouted, "I will not be dragged through the streets like a common criminal." But Colonel Koffi had no patience for theatrics. With a nod, 2 soldiers lifted Faure under his arms while a third took his legs. The former president's expensive shoes scraped against the marble floor as they carried him toward the stairs. Outside, news of the arrest spread like wildfire through social media. Videos from phones showed the palace gates opening and crowds cheering as military vehicles emerged. #Togo Rising and #Freedom Day exploded across Twitter and Facebook. The most powerful image came from photographer Marie-Claire Adjovi, who captured the exact moment when the palace doors opened and Faure Gnassingbé was brought out, carried by soldiers while crowds of citizens pressed against barriers, some weeping with joy, others cheering, all witnessing the end of an era. That photograph would define the revolution. By 8 a.m., Every major street in Lomé was flooded with people. They came from the crowded neighborhoods of B and Nikanakpo, from the markets of Asagame, from the university where so many students had been silenced. They carried Togolese flags, handmade signs, and decades of hope finally set free. Akojua Mensah, a teacher who had been fired for refusing to use government propaganda in her classroom, stood in Independence Square with tears streaming down her face. Around her, thousands of voices rose in song, not the national anthem corrupted by dictatorship, but old resistance songs passed down through generations. "My grandmother died waiting to see this day," she told reporters. She lived through colonialism, through military coups, through the rise of the Gnassingbé dynasty. She always said the people would rise again. She was right. The celebration wasn't uniform across the country. In northern regions where the ruling family had maintained support through patronage, people waited cautiously to see what would happen next. But in the south, where opposition had always been strongest, the joy was uncontainable. At the University of Kpalim, students tore down the giant portrait of Faure that had dominated the campus for over a decade. In Tsevi, market women danced in the streets, carrying photos of relatives who had disappeared during the dark years. Freedom had finally come to Togo. By noon, the news had reached every capital that mattered. In Washington, President Trump's security team held an emergency meeting. Togo had been a partner in fighting terrorism in West Africa, despite its lack of democracy. The overnight collapse of the Gnassingbé regime created both opportunities and uncertainties. "What do we know about Colonel Koffi?" Secretary of State Blinken asked. "Clean record," the CIA briefer responded. "No corruption, no human rights violations. More importantly, he's been meeting with civil society groups for months. This wasn't a typical military coup, it has genuine popular support." In Paris, President Macron faced difficult choices. France had long supported stability over democracy in West Africa. But French public opinion increasingly demanded support for genuine democratic movements. The African Union called for respect for human rights and rule of law, without taking sides. But the most important support came from fellow African democracies. Ghana sent legal experts, Senegal provided election training, South Africa offered experience with truth and reconciliation. The message was clear. If Togo could transition successfully to democracy, it wouldn't stand alone. Within hours of his arrest, Faure Gnassingbé found himself in a cell at Lomé Central Police Station, the same facility where many of his opponents had been detained over the years. Captain Dassé personally oversaw the booking process, reading him rights that had been systematically denied to thousands of Togolese citizens during his rule. "You have the right to legal representation. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to know the charges against you." The preliminary charges were extensive. Embezzling over $2 billion in state funds, ordering the killing of protesters, rigging multiple elections, violating the Constitution. But behind each charge were real people, families destroyed, lives lost, dreams deferred. Ajua Taki had waited 17 years for this moment. Her husband, journalist Wisdom Taki, had disappeared in 2006 while investigating government corruption. Documents seized from the palace revealed surveillance files detailing his final days. "I never gave up hope for justice," she told reporters. "Not just for my husband, but for all of us who suffered in silence." The hardest part wasn't removing Faure from power, it was building something better. Colonel Koffi understood that military coups, even popular ones, carried dangers. History was full of well-intentioned officers who removed dictators only to become dictators themselves. To avoid this trap, he had spent months secretly meeting with opposition leaders and civil society groups. The Togolese Transitional Council, announced 48 hours after Faure's arrest, was the most inclusive political body in the country's history. Dr. Bridget Ajimagbo Johnson, a longtime opposition economist, became interim prime minister. Archbishop Philippe Kpadzro agreed to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first major test came 5 days later when loyalist forces in northern Depayang attempted a counter-coup. But instead of immediate military action, the transitional government sent religious leaders and traditional chiefs to negotiate. After 6 tense hours, the loyalist commander surrendered without bloodshed. His soldiers, seeing overwhelming popular support for change, chose to join the new Togo rather than fight for the old one. The documents found in the presidential palace shocked even experienced investigators. Detective Inspector Amegishi had seen plenty of crimes in 15 years of police work. But nothing prepared him for the basement archives of the palace. Surveillance files on over 50,000 citizens, bank records showing the theft of foreign aid, audio recordings where political assassinations were discussed like grocery shopping. Most damning were the election records showing exactly how every vote since 2005 had been manipulated. Ballot boxes stuffed, vote counts altered, and in some rural areas results simply invented without holding elections at all. The revelations triggered massive demonstrations demanding immediate trials. Some protesters called for public executions. Others wanted all former government employees banned from public service. Interim Prime Minister Ajimagba Johnson addressed the nation on television, walking a careful line between acknowledging anger and maintaining rule of law. Justice will be served, she promised. But it will be justice under law, not justice under emotion. We will not become what we fought against. Chapter 10. International Acceptance. 3 weeks after the revolution, the West African bloc ECOWAS held an emergency summit in Nigeria to discuss Togo. The regional leaders faced a delicate situation. Some, particularly those with their own political problems, worried about setting precedents for removing sitting presidents. Others recognized that genuine popular uprisings deserved support. Nigeria's President Tinubu, whose country dominated the region, put it simply, "The question isn't whether we approve of how Gnassingbé was removed. The question is whether we support the Togolese people's right to determine their future." ECOWAS issued a careful statement accepting the transition while calling for rapid movement toward civilian rule and monitored elections. The African Union followed with similar language. More important than official recognition was practical support flowing from across Africa. Democratic governments sent experts, observers, and advisors to help Togo build the institutions of democracy from scratch. 6 months after his arrest, Faure Gnassingbé sat in the dock facing charges that could mean life in prison. The trial became the most watched legal proceeding in West African history. International journalists filled the press gallery while closed-circuit television carried proceedings to viewing centers across Togo. Chief Prosecutor Akwit Lawson methodically presented evidence of systematic human rights violations. Video testimony from torture survivors. Financial records showing theft of money meant for schools and hospitals. Transcripts of meetings where assassinations were planned. The defense argued that Faure had inherited an authoritarian system and faced constant threats that justified harsh measures. They painted him as a leader trying to modernize while dealing with pressure and instability. But the most powerful moments came when victims testified. Koffi Yemegnen, a farmer whose land was seized for a presidential vacation resort, quietly described watching his family's generations-old farm bulldozed while soldiers prevented him from saving even basic possessions. Efua Kpacha, daughter of an opposition leader who died in custody, testified about years of harassment and surveillance. Her voice never wavered as she described finding listening devices in her university room and being followed by agents even while studying abroad. While the trial proceeded, the transitional government tackled the enormous challenge of rebuilding democracy. The Constitutional Convention brought together 200 delegates representing every region, profession, and civil society group. For 3 months, they debated fundamental questions: presidential or parliamentary system, how to prevent another concentration of power, what role for traditional authorities. Dr. Maya M. Ever, a constitutional scholar who had returned from 20 years of exile in Canada, chaired the Judicial Committee. Her job was designing courts that could resist political interference while maintaining public confidence. "We're not just writing laws," she told delegates during one heated session. "We're trying to institutionalize the values that brought us together. How do we make sure dictatorship never returns?" The final document, approved by 89% of delegates, created a parliamentary democracy with strong checks and balances. The president would be directly elected but with limited powers. The prime minister would head government and answer to parliament. An independent constitutional court could overturn laws violating citizens' rights. Most importantly, the Constitution prevented power concentration. No president could serve more than 2 terms. Military officers were banned from politics. A new ombudsman's office could investigate and prosecute corruption up to the highest levels. On a humid December morning 18 months after his arrest, Faure Gnassingbé learned his fate. Chief Judge Honorine Nanagisoa read the verdict in a packed courtroom while thousands more gathered around television screens across the country. On the charge of crimes against humanity, the judge announced, "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered, others wept. A few shouted curses at the man who had controlled their lives for so long. Faure showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as judgment was pronounced. The sentence was 25 years in prison, not the life term prosecutors wanted, but enough to ensure he would never hold power again. The court also ordered forfeiture of $1.8 billion in assets to be returned to the Togolese treasury. International reaction was swift and positive. Human Rights Watch called it landmark accountability. The European Union announced increased aid for democratic transition. But the most meaningful response came from ordinary Togolese. In villages and cities across the country, people gathered to celebrate not just the verdict, but what it represented, the restoration of rule of law and hope for a different future. 2 years after the revolution, Togo held its first genuinely free election in over 4 decades. The campaign was unlike anything in modern Togolese history. Candidates held rallies without fear of arrest. Journalists reported freely. Civil society groups trained observers and educated voters. 7 candidates qualified for president. Interim Prime Minister Ajimagbo Johnson ran on her transition record. Opposition veteran Gabriel Kodjo promised radical economic change. Colonel Koffi, reluctantly persuaded to run, offered security and gradual reform. The most interesting candidate was 34-year-old tech entrepreneur Selim Klasu, who had returned from Silicon Valley to lead a youth movement demanding rapid modernization. His rallies, conducted online and in packed stadiums, drew crowds no traditional politician could match. Election day was a festival of democracy. Polling stations opened before dawn for eager voters, some walking hours to exercise rights denied for decades. International and domestic observers monitored everything while citizens celebrated their freedom to choose. No candidate won outright. Ajimagbo Johnson led with 38%, followed by Klasu with 29%, Kodjo with 19%, and Koffi with 11%. The runoff between experience and change would determine what kind of democracy the revolution had created. The runoff campaign between Dr. Ajimagbo Johnson and Selim Klasu offered a clear choice between careful reform and bold transformation. Ajimagbo Johnson, now 52, campaigned on stability and detailed policy plans. Her rallies emphasized experience and gradual improvement. Klasu represented a generation that had grown up under dictatorship but dreamed of technological progress and rapid development. His vision of digital democracy where citizens could participate directly through technology drew massive crowds. Their televised debate became the most watched program in Togolese history. For 3 hours, they discussed everything from agriculture to internet infrastructure, from women's rights to military reform. "We cannot build new Togo with old thinking," Klasu argued. "We need fresh approaches for the world our children will inherit." "Democracy requires experience and patience," Ajimagbo Johnson responded. "We cannot afford to learn on the job when stakes are so high." Over 85% of voters participated in the runoff. The atmosphere was festive but peaceful, with musicians performing outside polling stations and vendors selling Democracy Day shirts. Selim Klasu won with 54% of the vote. At 34, he would become the youngest president in Togo's history. His victory speech in Independence Square, where crowds had celebrated Faure's arrest, was broadcast across Africa and streamed globally. "Today Togo chose future over past," he declared. "We chose hope over fear, unity over division, democracy over dictatorship. The Togo our children inherit will be the Togo they deserve, free, prosperous, and proud." 5 years after soldiers dragged a dictator from his palace, Togo had become something few thought possible, a functioning democracy in a region still struggling with authoritarian rule. President Klasu had implemented digital governance, allowing citizens to track government spending, petition for policy changes, and participate in local decisions online. The economy, freed from corruption, grew 7% annually. Togo became a refuge for those fleeing instability, a hub for technology startups, and proof that West African democracy was not just possible but profitable. Faure Gnassingbé, now 61, remained in Lomé Central Prison, writing memoirs few wanted to publish. His family lived quietly in France on assets that escaped seizure. Colonel Koffi, promoted to general and defense minister, oversaw a smaller but professional military that saw its role as protecting democracy, not enforcing the will of whoever held power. Dr. Ajimagbo Johnson returned to teaching but remained active in civil society, leading an organization training election observers across West Africa. Her work contributed to successful democratic transitions in 3 neighboring countries inspired by the Togolese example. In a village outside Kpalim, a statue commemorated not the fall of a dictator but the rise of a people. The inscription read simply, "Here freedom was born again." Togo's revolution had become more than history. It was proof that even the most entrenched dictatorship could fall when ordinary people decided they deserved better, when soldiers chose conscience over orders, and when the desire for freedom overcame fear of change.